violent and determined confrontations, the universities decided to make some concessions to the people, the students who were very unhappy. And what they did was create a college of ethnic studies. And that college at San Francisco State University, it was the birthing room, essentially, of this new study, this new practice, educational force, which we are dealing with now. There were just a few racial groups who were involved at the beginning, and from that University of Ethnic Studies, that sort of concretized around those groups. And we're going to be talking about how this very radical beginning has now become part of something that is entering preschool and elementary school and high school curricula. And we're going to start with, well, first I'll tell you who I am. I'm Lori Lowenthal Marcus, and I am the legal director of the Deborah Project. And I'll tell you what I've been doing with respect to ethnic studies in a little while. But first, we're going to start with Elena Kaplan. Elena is a co-founder and the president of the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, which is a nonpartisan grassroots coalition working to remove the narrow ideological agendas from ethnic studies in K through 12. Elena has managed nonprofits for over 15 years, and her organization, I can say, is a very productive, worthwhile enterprise, one that should be emulated and joined in. And Elena, if you will begin, please.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you so much to all of our sponsors and our organizers. I am going to share my screen for a few minutes here, so bear with me for a moment. Hold on. This is one of my favorite things to do, is argue with my screen. Okay, can you guys see a full screen? Somebody, okay. Okay. So first, let's start here. What are we talking about when we talk about ethnic studies? Well, it turns out that nobody can actually agree on what ethnic studies is. And that's where part of the problem begins. However, you can generally break it up into two general approaches to ethnic studies. So what we call constructive ethnic studies, which does all the things that you would expect ethnic studies to do. So building bridges of understanding, talking about ethnic group contributions and accomplishments, focusing on open inquiry, kind of all the stuff that you would think the words ethnic studies mean. And then there's a different model that goes by critical ethnic studies. Yes, there is a connection with critical race theory, with CRT. Recently, it started going by liberated ethnic studies. And that model is a very different paradigm. So it focuses on oppressor versus victim. So the idea is that the entire world is divided up into two boxes. You're either an oppressor or you're a victim. So already you can start to imagine all sorts of things that can come out of that type of paradigm, that type of ideology. And it is indeed a specific ideology and a movement that focuses, that works to challenge imperialistic colonial hegemonic beliefs and practices. Some of you, your ears will perk up when you hear this, and again, we'll see what sorts of things can come out of that, including the anti-Semitism that can result from it. There's also a heavy emphasis on militant resistance as a means of social change. So you can see very different approaches to ethnic studies. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so I just wanted to show you, if you look at these images of the two books, two traditional textbooks that are used for the two types of approaches. The one on the left, you can see is much more constructive ethnic studies. You can see that it's a tapestry, presumably evokes this idea of a tapestry of cultures. And the one on the right, you're seeing this revolutionary pyramid with a guy and his fist up in the air. An even more evocative one is this very recent, within the last couple of months, this new cover of a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is the seminal text of critical/liberated ethnic studies. And in case it's not obvious, because it wasn't to me at first, what you're looking at is a rifle with a pencil on top of it. Again, you can use your imaginations to understand what type of approach, what material would be taught through this textbook. This is actually a text for teachers. And on the bottom, you can see the general orientation, this idea from the author, Paulo Freire, who writes about that the oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. So what, you might ask? What is it that is called forth? And that's where we get back to the militant resistance, the idea of overthrowing an entire system in order to fix the oppression that some in the society are facing, that many in the society are facing. So a little bit of history building on top of what Lori just gave us. We're going to fast forward from what Lori was describing to a bill in California. And I'm going to be focusing today specifically on California, but everything I have to say, unfortunately, applies to other states. So fortunately, we can learn from the experience in California. Unfortunately, all the same stuff applies. So there was a bill called AB 2016 in the year 2016, and the objective of that bill was to prepare students to be global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures. Who can argue with that, right? What possible negative consequences can come out of something like this? The bill was passed. This established that the ethnic studies model curriculum would be designed, would be developed, and that it would serve as a model curriculum for schools. Model curricula are never required, but that this would serve as the model. So take a look at this. And then it was followed by the following, an organization that calls itself Critical Ethnic Studies, now again going by Liberated Ethnic Studies. And this organization aims to bring into conversation the ways that concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to US imperialism ground our approaches for dismantling the neocolonial schooling apparatus. Now, getting beyond some of the gobbledygooky sounding language here, you can simply take a look at this, right? The contributions of other cultures so that people can build an appreciation in this. So clearly, something along the way got hijacked. And that's exactly what happened. This approach comes from academia, from a group of people that call themselves scholar activists. The emphasis is on activists. They say very openly, they call themselves that, and they say very openly that their goal is to promote activism, to be active in promoting a particular ideology. And the education part is part and parcel of that goal. They have taught this perspective that you're seeing here on college campuses for years, as Lori referred to. I would go so far as to say that if you are hearing about ethnic studies in college campuses and universities, it is 100% this type of ethnic studies. And I would challenge anybody to find me a type of ethnic studies, a university where ethnic studies is taught that is not this particular approach of it. And the folks that propagate these scholar activists that propagate critical ethnic studies decided that they are going to use this opportunity to infuse this type of ethnic studies, this ideology into K through 12, into classrooms. And incidentally, we are talking about K through 12. We're not just talking about high school. Originally, the ethnic studies model curriculum was intended for high school only, and then it just happened before anybody noticed. It turned into K through 12, and the model curriculum recommends that it be infused not only K through 12, but into every subject that is taught, and we'll get to that momentarily. Just a few words on the timeline. So just you have a sense of what happened. So first there were several initial drafts. 3 to 4, depending on how you count them, 3 to 4 various drafts of the ethnic studies model curriculum, abbreviated ESMC. It became the most controversial curriculum in California history with over 75,000 public comments. This took place over 2 years, and there was back and forth, and the governor got involved, and there was a lot of outcry once people found out what was being peddled as a model curriculum. The final draft ended up being slightly better in that some specific things are removed. So we no longer saw the reference to the foundation of Israel as the Nakba, the catastrophe. We no longer saw the BDS being recommended as a movement for students to be involved in. However, the framework stayed the same framework that calls forth these things, that calls forth teachers to recommend the BDS movement and so on, but slightly better. The Liberated Ethnic Studies group, abbreviated LESMC, or we'll call it Liberated for short, was formed based on the first draft of the ESMC. So stick with me for a moment here, bear with me. What happened here is that the group that wrote that initial draft got so upset about the slight changes that were made to the ESMC that they asked to have their names removed altogether and said, we're forming our own thing. It's going to be called the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. And this curriculum basically became that first draft of the ESMC on steroids, as I like to call it. So the same thing, only worse. A bill was passed at around the same time in 2021, a few months later, that made ethnic studies a California graduation requirement. It included what some refer to as guardrails to try to prevent the rejected material, that offensive, that biased material from creeping into the classroom. The effectiveness of the guardrails we'll talk about later on is up for debate, but nevertheless, we now have a requirement in California that ethnic studies is taken by all students in public and charter schools, and of course, private schools are following as well. That same legislation is currently in process in a multitude of states, including, as you'll hear later, in Massachusetts, and there's discussion of what that'll look like. Liberated, or LESMC, launched a national effort this year, and they are now marching district by district, state by state, and under the radar is, and they say this explicitly, is kind of the motto of when necessary, go under the radar. And that is part of how we got here today, because so much of it went under the radar that we, the public, were not paying attention. And so by the time people woke up, it became very difficult to tackle it. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of these and we can go back to them. This is just to give you an idea of what the principles are like. So we're critiquing all sorts of things: white supremacy, racism, cis heteropatriarchy, capitalism. So note capitalism in the same category as racism and patriarchy and so on. A lot of emphasis on colonialism. Turns out it doesn't have to be this way. And so here's an example of different guiding principles. So we can either, as the LESMC recommends, connect ourselves to resistance movements and struggle and ensure a truer democracy, where truer democracy, incidentally, is a Marxist term for the abolition of private property. Or we can, as an example of constructive ethnic studies does, explore historic and contemporary racism while inspiring students and emphasizing dignity and worth of every individual based on a common humanity. So you can see that, just so you can get a sense of the wording, how those are, how the principles themselves are fundamentally different. One of the things that really helps understand what these curriculum are like is who are held up as the role models. And so there's a consistent choice. If you go to our website, you'll see an entire list, a sampling of the militant neo-Marxist role models that are chosen. And so examples include Oscar Lopez Rivera, for example, that was responsible for over 100 bombings in US cities. These are all held up as role models. However, missing are the people that most ethnic groups would generally hold up as what they see as the paragons of activism. And that includes folks like Norman Mineta, Thurgood Marshall, Frederick Douglass, who's also missing people like Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and other peaceful leaders that work within the system. And in fact, civil rights leaders are described as passive and docile. You can see a very touching letter by Dr. Clarence Jones, who was the speechwriter for MLK. He actually was the drafter of the I Have a Dream speech, writing about how horrendous this type of curriculum is for students. Acknowledging there's a specific ideology behind this particular type of ethnic studies. In teacher training, we have the teacher trainer talking about how the Marxist underpinnings of ethnic studies might scare people away, but, and this is a quote, teachers need to be grounded in the correct politics to educate students. Back to this if we need to. What does Israel and BDS have to do with all this? BDS, of course, is the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel. So the Third World Liberation Front, which is the basis of critical ethnic study, is both a group and a political ideology that historically includes anti-Israel advocacy. So that's how it gets in here to begin with. All 13 members of the founding board of the Critical Ethnic Studies Association are BDS activists. And so it's not surprising that BDS and Israel bashing, so to speak, ends up in critical ethnic studies. Here's an example from another teacher training where the slide talks about police strategies have been transnationalized with US and Israeli police departments exchanging tactics, and the global prison industrial complex is being tested in its extreme forms in Palestine. This is what I'm showing you is training that is actually taking place or has taken place already. So how does this show up in the actual curriculum? The very first portion of the Liberated Ethnic Studies model curriculum that was published was not about African Americans, it was not about Latino Americans, it was not about Asians, and it was not about Native Americans. It was specifically the Teach Palestine toolkit that included some of these quotes, for example, referred to current apartheid in Israel. This is an instruction to teachers. So the word toolkit refers to instructions to teachers. And this is, by the way, where we find the instruction to go under the radar
Elina, if we can, maybe we can provide this to people who are interested at the end. Unfortunately, you've given a tremendous amount of information in 15 minutes, which is not unfortunate. The unfortunate part is we have got to move on to the next speaker, but really.
Absolutely. So I will be happily, thank you, Lori. I will happily share a lot of this information and can share the PowerPoint with folks. And so I think we will move on to the next one, and then we can come back during the question and answer period. We can go through some of the other information in terms of what you can do and what actions can be taken.
Terrific. Thank you, Elina. Okay, our next speaker is Rob Leikind. Rob is the regional director of the American Jewish Committee in the Boston and the New England area. He's been at the AJC since 2008. He's also trained as a lawyer, but has done several other things since then, including spent quite a few years as director of various offices of the Anti-Defamation League. So Rob is going to be talking to us about the legislative and political action that's taking place now with respect to ethnic studies in Massachusetts. Rob? Where is Rob?
Rob, you should be able to unmute. I'm asking you to. You have to unmute yourself.
Got it.
Go.
Okay.
Great.
So the first thing I want to say is that was, Elina, that was such a thorough and excellent presentation. I'm thinking of ceding my time to you. It's really just really wonderfully done. And It's a very dense subject, and you covered it really wonderfully. I also want to just thank Ann Wayne and Sherry Voliker. I think I first spoke to you about this program 4 to 5 months ago, and you've just done a remarkable job putting it together. This is an important conversation, and I'm really glad to be part of it. Let me just start by offering two observations. First is something that Elina shared, but I think it's worth repeating. Ethnic studies is a term that's used for cover many types of curriculum and many types of educational lessons and programs. What we're talking about is critical ethnic studies. And anytime someone talks about these programs and call it ethnic studies, you have to say, stop. No, this is critical ethnic studies, because the distinction is important here. The second observation is that critical ethnic studies program, many people who are proponents of ethnic studies are focused on making our communities more hospitable to diversity, breaking down racial barriers, advancing racial justice. And so at a moment in time when communities are hyper-focused on ways to take concrete action to mitigate our nation's historic racial dysfunctions, it's not surprising that legislatures are also giving thought to what they can do. And so what I'm going to be talking with you about is one particular place in Massachusetts where an ethnic studies curriculum sort of almost came into being. And that bill was called an Act Relative to Racism, Equity, and Justice in Education. The bill said many, many things, but in the end, it really just introduced two ideas. One, ensure that students of color and students from immigrant and indigenous communities find their rightful place reflected in the history they learn, and that all Massachusetts students are given the chance to develop into informed and engaged members of society. Second, establish a commission for anti-racism and equity in education that will develop curriculum materials that will help dismantle racism. So let's take these one by one. There seems to be a broad agreement today that histories that are commonly taught in American classrooms generally touch only lightly on the stories of minorities and the persecutions they suffered in this country. And this has been especially true as concerns people of color. An example last year was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. Very few people heard about it until last year. There was a lot of publicity and histories came out and documentaries came out. This was literally a massacre that happened in the city of Tulsa 100 years ago, now 101 years ago, where scores of people were killed, thousands were left homeless, neighborhoods were destroyed, and that piece of history disappeared. A middle class, upper middle class Black community was wiped out. Now, it's true, American history is littered with these kinds of stories. Many people believe that it's urgent that these stories be part of our American history, which has had moments of glory and moments of darkness. The argument is that for Americans to be fully enfranchised, their stories have to be part of our American story. Now, speaking for AJC, we think that this is a compelling argument, and we support efforts to see our nation's history that is presented in a fuller and more accurate way that openly confronts our nation's darker moments while celebrating its successes. In our view, however, the goals of this bill that was proposed went well beyond the intention of correcting for curriculum that many now argue is white-centric and ignored the experiences, histories, and cultures of people of color. On its face, and that brings me to the second point. On its face, the commission that was proposed in this legislation sounded like it could be a good idea. But when we looked under the hood, we saw several problems. First, it was vague. The mandate for the commission basically gave little guidance as to what it would do. Among other things, it urged that the commission ensure that ethnic studies, racial justice, decolonizing history, and unlearning racism should be taught using a critical approach. Now, It was possible to guess at the intentions of the drafters, but none of these terms were defined or explained. The result was that a commission would have had tremendous discretion to interpret the meaning of its charge and then go about implementing it as its plans as it saw fit. Second problem, the commission as designed would have had limited accountability to the legislature, and it was unclear whether it would have even had any accountability to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for the state of Massachusetts. Third issue, there were roughly a dozen organizations, maybe a few more, I didn't count, that were assigned to select the members of the commission. These organizations, however, appeared to represent a very narrow segment of public opinion, including some groups that we had reason to think were disposed to introducing a critical ethnic studies curriculum here in Massachusetts. And to complicate matters, the legislation provided no criteria for the people that were to be invited, for what kind of people should be invited to serve on the commission. Finally, the proposed commission was given extraordinary powers to raise money, and whatever it did raise could roll over at the end of each fiscal year. To boot, there was no sunset provision, which means that the commission, with the ability to raise money and able to define its own agenda, would have existed in perpetuity. In looking at this, it became, I wouldn't say obvious, but it became more than possible that were this commission established on the terms described in the bill, we would have found ourselves in a situation similar to what happened in California and what Elina just described to us, where you would have had a group of people who would have been given authority to create curriculum and then project it into the community and create that curriculum before anybody even knew what was happening. In California, it was mentioned a bill was passed calling for the creation of an ethnic studies curriculum, and the responsible for creating that model curriculum was then passed on to the committee. We were looking at a very similar situation here. Given that experience, we had reason to wonder about this bill, and what enhanced our concern in this case was language that was used in the bill that, though never defined, came straight out of the ethnic studies playbook. For example, it talked about ensuring that ethnic studies, racial justice, decolonizing history, and unlearning racism is taught at all grade levels using a critical approach. That is language that only has meaning in the context of a critical ethnic studies curriculum model. Based upon what we already knew about in California, we thought the bill raised the concerns. And some of these I've already described, but just to repeat a little bit about what Elina said, there were others. The critical ethnic studies curriculum is structured around a set of rigid ideological arguments that are not hospitable to diverse points of view. They're not inclusive and present a racialized view of America that, while understandable, will lead our nation to a very, very difficult place. Perhaps more important for many of us in the Jewish community, the ideology's hostility to Jews and Jewish interests was demonstrable, and we were concerned and believed that if this curriculum moved forward in the way we imagined it might, we would find the same here in Massachusetts. Given these circumstances, together with several other organizations, we mounted a legislative effort, and eventually the bill was withdrawn. But I want to share a few observations by way of closing. Many of the supporters, as we began talking with people in the legislature and elsewhere, many of the supporters of the bill had no idea that they were supporting a critical ethnic studies curriculum. In fact, they'd never heard of critical ethnic studies. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know what happened in California. They were motivated by the thought that it might help right historic injustices and help young Black people and other minorities, especially all of those of color, to do better in school and become better citizens. I respect that aspiration and learned that making sure that the people we spoke with understood this and supported reasonable measures, that we supported reasonable measures, such as much needed improvements in history education, we saw that that opened the door to constructive conversation with members of the legislature and others. This said, we also understood that it was very important that we're clear about some of the very troubling elements of the curriculum that Elina pointed out, and I just mentioned a few. It seems that in this case, enough legislators understood these concerns, and that ultimately contributed to the demise of the bill in this past session. But it's very important to understand this discussion is not going to end. It's not going to end in Massachusetts. It's not going to end in other parts of the country where it started, and it will be launched in other places. There's an emerging national effort to bring critical ethnic studies curricula to schools across the country. In some regions, this campaign is achieving some success because there's a genuine wish to advance racial justice, and people are looking for solutions. Many people, perhaps most, are not motivated by a particular interest in critical ethnic studies, but if it's the most likely alternative, they may go for it. I suspect that that's what got the ball rolling here in Massachusetts. This means that while we need to continue to make people aware of the critical ethnic studies model is not only hostile to Jewish people, it's also hostile to the American project. We also need to talk about ways that schools can introduce serious programs that are genuinely inclusive, don't make our educational goals secondary to political goals, teach students to be engaged citizens, and have no room for anti-Semitism or other forms of prejudice. The good news is that there are alternatives to critical ethnic studies, and we need to introduce them into the larger discussion. Just a suggestion, perhaps that can be our next program. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Rob, for a very optimistic but well-reasoned at the same time perspective. Now we're going to hear from Steve Stotsky, who is with CAMRA. I think probably everybody here knows what CAMRA is and does on behalf of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. CAMRA has now, Steve has been with CAMRA for 17 years, but I was shocked, as others might be, to learn that it's recently begun an educational institute. And Steve runs that, he's the head of that. And he is crafting an effort to use the critical analysis that CAMRA uses with respect to the media and its misrepresentations of Israel to education. And unfortunately, the growing efforts to present Israel within both higher education, but also K-12 in a very false and unflattering light. So Steve, why don't you tell us what's happening with educational initiatives in Massachusetts and what CAMRA's doing about it?
Sure. Thank you, Lori. Appreciate your words. And I also want to express my appreciation to Elina and Rob for your very thoughtful words as well. My words will reflect much of what Rob and Elina says, but I think I will come at it from a somewhat different angle and orientation. Anti-Israel activists have co-opted the discipline of ethnic studies to the anti-Zionist cause. In California, the state's vetting process rejected the first draft version that included anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment, yet that failed to stop its advocates from peddling their tainted version to school districts across the state. That is what is coming to Massachusetts. The proposed Massachusetts bill that Rob talked about called for developing curriculum materials with a social justice perspective on dismantling racism and sought to ensure that ethnic studies, racial justice, decolonizing history, and unlearning racism are taught at all grade levels. The slogan and jargon-laden language of that bill reflects its ideological orientation, and along with the involvement of at least one individual associated with the rejected anti-Israel curriculum in California, are warning signs of problems to come. In California, the people chosen to develop the state's ethnic studies model curriculum had an extreme political agenda. The process was largely shielded from the public eye until Jewish groups got wind of the version's promotion of the anti-Israel boycott campaign and uncovered vulgar anti-Semitic tropes, including a song about Jews controlling world media. In Massachusetts, a similar lack of public scrutiny was evident in the drafting of the proposed bill. The committee proposed by the bill consisted of representatives from various racial and ethnic activist groups and teachers' unions, but failed to include any reputable scholar of the history of American ethnic groups. While this bill failed, its proponents continue to press for a curriculum whose purpose is to encourage school children to define themselves by their distinct group identity. In its currently favored configuration, it encourages students to engage in activism and political resistance on the basis of their group identity, pitting different racial groups against others. An ethnic studies curriculum is currently being piloted in 5 Boston public schools, but the materials, books, handouts, films, and lesson plans are not publicly available. This lack of transparency is always worrisome. 12 of 13 Boston City councilors signed a letter supporting a teachers group called Ethnic Studies Now. The group's website says it resists white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy, and seeks to bring about societal transformation and social justice by harnessing students for solidarity and collective action. This is the language of indoctrination, not education. So what is the context for the demand for an ethnic studies curriculum in Massachusetts? A member of the Boston Teachers Union testified at the hearing for the proposed bill. He said, quote, "It wasn't until after college that I began to understand systemic oppression and how the centuries-long and continuous struggle of Native Americans, Black Americans, Latin Americans, and Asian Americans was largely erased from the history that I learned," end quote. Now, we frequently hear heartfelt statements like this to explain the need for an ethnic studies curriculum. The preamble to the bill states that, quote, "racial education disparities and white-centric history have fostered lies." But it offers nothing to support this charge except more jargon. The presumption is that the existing school curriculum fails to address the injustices experienced by racial and other minority groups or credit their contribution to our society. But in fact, the highly praised Massachusetts History and Social Studies curriculum framework developed in 2003 provided students with an accurate recounting of slavery and paid extensive attention to the experiences and contributions of minorities and women. These themes are woven into both the middle school social studies and high school American history standards. Nevertheless, the framework was revised in 2018 to increase the emphasis on African Americans and other minorities under the guise of making K-12 students more active citizens. For example, 4 of 13 Massachusetts figures from the pre-Revolutionary War years deemed important for students to learn about were African American. This was at a time when African Americans comprised less than 3% of the total population, and their role in the revolution was correspondingly modest. Increased coverage of African Americans, Latinos, women, and gay rights activists comes at the expense of the European ethnic groups whose individual histories are now crammed together so that their unique characteristics are lost. The history of the most numerous and influential ethnic group in Massachusetts, the Irish, receives scant attention. The Department of Education also added to its website resources to address themes of racism and cultural responsiveness in a section labeled Culturally Responsive Teaching and Leading. The Jews are another casualty of this shift in emphasis. Jewish contributions to American culture, prosperity, and science are invisible. The first substantive treatment of Jews is as victims in the Holocaust. The 2018 revisions also included changes to teaching about modern Israel that cast Israel as an illegitimate occupier. A new item instructs students to learn about, quote, Palestinian loss of land and the creation of refugees by Israeli military action. That statement perpetuates the falsehood that Israel military action caused most of the Arab flight and the subsequent refugee problem, and that the land on which Israel was established was formerly Palestinian land. In the 2003 middle school standards on ancient Israel, the heading stated, "The roots of Western civilization, ancient Israel." This heading was changed to Ancient Israel, Palestine. The significance of this change is evident in the revised instructions. The original standard instructs teachers to, quote, explain the expulsion and dispersion of the Jews to other lands and the renaming of the country by the Romans from Judea to Palestine. The 2018 revisions removes this explanation of the origin of the name Palestine, hampering students' ability to assess the indigeneity claims of Jews and of Arabs who arrived centuries later. So why tamper with a curriculum that raised Massachusetts students to the top of the nation in every subject tested? There are only a few studies that claim to show benefits to students exposed to an ethnic studies course. The most cited studies were conducted by professors Thomas D., Emily Penner, and Said Bania, which claimed improved graduation rates and better grades for minority students who received an ethnic studies course. The study was flawed, however. Even the authors questioned their results. Professors Richard Sanders and Abraham Weiner evaluated their data and concluded, I quote, "The experiment on which these studies' conclusions are based is so muddled and the data reported is so ambiguous that in fact they support no conclusion, either positive or negative." So with no evidence of academic benefit, what is the downside to an ethnic studies curriculum? Many are concerned that an ethnic studies curriculum will inject into the classroom dangerous stereotypes about Jews and cast Israel as an international pariah, as happened in California. Anti-Zionism has become the rallying cry of an influential ethnic studies faction called Liberated Ethnic Studies, which Elina spoke about. Siding with the Palestinians is not due to a small group of anti-Israel activists wielding an outsized voice. Liberated Ethnic Studies has fully adopted the anti-Zionist cause. Tammy Rossman Benjamin, a California academic who has exposed the anti-Israel ideology and ethnic studies movement in California, warned of an organized campaign to inject anti-Zionism into schools nationwide, again, as Elina spoke about. CAMRA has uncovered evidence of their activity through teacher workshops, webinars, and political organizing. Promotional literature from one recent ethnic studies event for teachers boldly proclaimed, "Fight Zionist and right-wing attacks." So what do some leading figures in the liberated ethnic studies say about Israel and Jews? Well, reacting to the efforts by Jews to keep anti-Israel and anti-Semitic content out of the ethnic studies curriculum, Teresa Montano, Chicano studies professor at Cal State Northridge, stated in a podcast in March 2021, "You have one very rich, very, very wealthy, and very well-connected segment of the community that pushed back on the curriculum. But it taught us this, that white privilege and white racism in the state of California is alive and well." Palestinian American activist Lara Kizwani leads an organization called AROC that seeks to entwine anti-Zionism into the entire fabric of the social justice movement. Her message is that Zionists are the arch enemy of the entire ethnic studies community. Samia Shoman, a Palestinian American activist and educator, advises teachers on how to integrate Palestinian propaganda into their classroom lessons. She says, "Start with your students' lives. What issues are most resonant for them? How can you connect Palestine? You might want to center gentrification and forced relocation, criminalization of youth, or hip hop as resistance." At a seminar promoting Arab American inclusion in the ethnic studies curriculum, she showed a map of the Middle East that included Palestine, but no Israel. Jody Sokolauer, a teacher, peddles a book she wrote for middle school children, teaching them to hate Israel. A review of her book is available on CAMRA's website. Rabab Abdulhadi, professor of ethnic studies at San Francisco State University, warns her followers not to bow down to the racist and colonial project of the Israel lobby industry. Alison Tintianko-Kubalis, an advisor to the coalition that proposed the Massachusetts bill, affirmed her support for, quote, specifically including chapters of Palestine. She stated, quote, "I want to be clear, that is the choice that we made." These activists reject the traditional goals of American education. They regard most American Jews as enemies and see Israel strictly as an oppressor. They are not a fringe group within the ethnic studies community of California. They represent their center. Boston's Ethnic Studies Now group has enlisted as advisors several of the people I just mentioned. The existing Massachusetts curriculum framework already devotes extensive coverage to the history of African Americans, women, and other minorities. We need to insist that any effort to develop an ethnic studies curriculum involve reputable historians and people who have been voted to represent the groups covered. The faction that currently dominates ethnic studies puts students on a path of political activism and indoctrination. What they advocate is not an educational curriculum. It claims to address a problem in Massachusetts education curriculum that does not exist, while creating an opening for those who push dangerous anti-Israel and anti-Semitic narrative in K through 12 education. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Steve. So many of the people that and groups that Steve mentioned are ones I know all too well. As the legal director of the Deborah Project, we brought a lawsuit in California in federal court against the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium. That's the group that Elena talked about. They were most of the people in that, in the consortium were the drafters of the early model curriculum, which was rejected by the people of California and by the government of California. And the reason the Deborah Project, which represents people who have been discriminated against in educational settings because they're Jewish and or pro-Israel, the reason we became involved in California in the liberated ethnic studies issue is because, you know, they seem to always go hand in hand. There was a BDS resolution being addressed and discussed and passed at lower levels of the teachers union in Los Angeles. And some teachers were very upset about that, and parents. And so the Deborah Project began to provide legal assistance to those Jewish individuals. And while we were discussing and addressing the BDS resolution in the teachers union, we began to hear about this liberated ethnic studies consortium and the effort to resurrect what had been rejected by the people of California and the government of California, introduce it, integrate it into the public schools curriculum by stealth manner, actually. And they say it, they admit it. I spent well over a year reviewing the website from this consortium, and they actually give advice to teachers to fly under the radar, to shut your doors if you think that the administrators in your school won't be supportive, or if some of those, quote, Zionist, and they use this as a pejorative, those Zionist organizations are in your community and may make trouble for you. So as I grew to understand what is this thing called ethnic studies, it seemed to me like a good idea that people would learn about all the different communities in a given area. How could that be bad? But as Elena pointed out, and Steve pointed out, that unfortunately, a lot of what's driving this effort to address what had been marginalized or not addressed at all in the public educational system in the United States, rather than adding positives about these different groups, much of the effort was made to attack others, the oppressors, the occupiers, the colonialists, that is the white people who run this country, who have controlled everything. And it is extremely divisive. It isn't about raising up. It is about bringing down. Again, I am talking about the liberated / critical ethnic studies variation, but that is what is really driving ethnic studies, both in California and across this country, in schools everywhere, including Massachusetts and other places. So people need to understand what we're talking about and who is controlling this, who is driving it, what's being driven, and what the buzzwords are that you need to look for. When the Deborah Project was looking into what was happening in California, we found out that although, as I said at the very beginning, the Third World Liberation Front and the Black Panther ideology that set off this whole ethnic studies as a study in the United States was brought about through these striking students, and the decision at this initial School of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University was 4 racialized groups: Black Americans, Hispanic Latinx Americans, Indigenous Americans, Native Americans, and Asian American Pacific Islanders. Those are the 4 groups that were active during the strikes. And so the people who came together in the School of Ethnic Studies out at San Francisco State University decided that that is what ethnic studies means, not any other group. And I have heard it from people involved in the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium and the teachers who support this version of ethnic studies, that they are not interested in multiculturalism. They are not interested in diversity. They are interested in the promotion of these 4 groups only, and about how they have been oppressed and dispossessed. Now, here's how this Jewish part comes in. Somehow, Palestine, the Palestinian struggle, is part of the Asian American Pacific Islander group. How, you say? Yes, I agree. How? I don't really quite understand it, other than there are Muslims in that part of the world. But of course, Palestine, Teach Palestine, and the Palestine portion of the Liberated Ethnic Studies is a Marxist-Leninist version. It is secular. It is not supporting Muslim rights. Really, it is an ideology, political ideology. Anyway, they're admitted. Palestine is part of the Asian American Pacific Islander group. They insist, and the Jews from the same exact geographic region are not included. So it's a little hard to understand how they would make this distinction, as we say in the law, with a straight face, but they do. And the portion of the curriculum that deals with, and Elena began to touch on this, that deals with Palestine is from a website, teachpalestine.org. All of this has now been taken down off the internet, but you can probably still find it with a Wayback Machine, as I did for the parts that I hadn't screen captured. And Israel is only discussed as a colonialist Western occupying force that engages in apartheid and ethnic cleansing. In one of the lesson plans, the definitions for settler is a Jew who has stolen the land and the homes of the native indigenous Palestinians. So the Palestinians are explained as the indigenous people, not the Jews. This is taught to children. The lesson plans are for elementary school through high school. It's very distressing and problematic. And I'll tell you a few things. One of the things that the liberated folks say is to criticize the government of Israel is not anti-Semitic. They have decided that. That's nice. They have also decided and teach as fact that Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism. It's completely distinct. So for anyone who wants, I can send them a copy of our complaint where we go through pages and pages of explanation for Zion, that is Israel, being central to Judaism. Doesn't mean every Jew is a Zionist, but it is a fact that Zion is central to Judaism. So we did bring a lawsuit. We brought it against the Liberated Consortium. They're the ones that Elena described earlier, the ones who drafted the original model curriculum and are now peddling their version of ethnic studies to California schools in school districts and other school districts across the country. We also brought it against Teresa Montano, as Steve mentioned her. She is one of the officers of the consortium, and she's an ethnic studies professor at a California community college. We brought it against the head of the consortium. We also brought it against the Los Angeles Teachers Union, because they are very supportive, very, very supportive of the liberated ethnic studies being introduced and coming into the classroom in Los Angeles. It's under the radar. Los Angeles School District has not signed a contract with the Liberated Consortium. Other school districts in California already have, but it's still being brought into the classrooms, and it is really a problem for the Jews. We all know, I think everybody on this webinar listening in, you know how bad things are on college campuses for Jews and Zionists. Just imagine what it's going to be like when kids who have learned how evil Israel, the Jewish state, is, when they finally get to college. They don't have to be convinced. They already know as fact that Israel, the Jewish state, is evil and Jews are evil. Let's tie it together. In California and Los Angeles, not this spring, the spring before, when there was a conflict in Gaza, there were supporters of Palestine in caravans through Jewish neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And they were shouting from their cars as they waved Palestinian flags that Israel murders innocent Palestinian children and women. And Israel is a bunch of murderers. One of the cars stopped in front of a kosher sushi restaurant, and men jumped out of their car and they yelled to the diners sitting outside eating their sushi, "Who are the Jews?" They didn't say, "Who are the Israelis?" They said, "Who are the Jews?" And then when they saw some Jews, they began to beat them up. So it is dangerous. This is very bad. I would love for there to be more ethnic studies programs in schools, and there may be some now. I don't know of them. I'm a lawyer. My job is to go after the bad guys. But I do know that the bad version, critical version, liberated version of ethnic studies is aflame. It is spreading throughout California and this country, and it's coming to Massachusetts, and it's coming to many, many other states as well. So I hope this brief overview will provide the incentive for listeners to educate yourselves about this topic. And we're going to go into the question and answer period now. I hope that people will ask the panelists what you can do. I hope the panelists will explain what they think people listening need to do. Those who haven't yet been active, every one of the panelists, we're already working hard to stop this very dangerous anti-Semitic educational effort. Everybody needs to do that. So I'm going to start, and I want every one of the panelists to tell the listeners what you think the listeners should do in order to begin to prevent this dangerous form of ethnic studies from coming to their community. Let's start with Elina.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I think that among all of us, we have quite a range of experience and ideas that are consistent in some ways and divergent in other ways. And I think it's all good that we're discussing all of these. So I will share my screen for a moment so that you can get to see some of the actions that we're talking about. The guardrails that are put into various legislations are only as good as the guards. And who are the guards? The guards are all of us. The guards are people like Lori, who are out there and filing lawsuits. The guards are every one of us who are bringing this to everybody's attention and bringing it forth. So how do you do that? One sec. Okay. Find out what students are learning, whether you have grandchildren or children, talk to your friends' children, talk to your friends' grandchildren, find out what the students are learning, ask them, and if you're concerned, communicate directly with the schools, with the administration, and let any of us here know. Let Lori know, let ACES know, let Steve know. If you're in Massachusetts, let Rob know. Keep in touch with us. Reach out proactively. I saw that there was a question about what can we do proactively. Reach out to the principal, the superintendent. Doesn't matter if you're part of the school. You are a constituent, you're a taxpayer, you are well within your rights to reach out to your district, the superintendent, the board, and find out, build those relationships and get the information about what's happening with ethnic studies. Information is absolutely key. So if you can get the information out there, it may be that you like to write, then write letters to the editor. It may be that you're attending meetings. It may be that school board meetings. It may be that you get yourself on a committee, on a curriculum committee, which is sure to get to this point. Most importantly, talk to other parents, other grandparents, other people to spread the word. There was a question or comment that I saw about how do we engage non-Jewish communities, and that is absolutely key. Do reach out. This is not just bad for the Jews. This is bad for everybody. Whether or not we hear from Black parents who are saying that this type of curriculum is teaching my child that he will always be a victim and I don't want it, or from others who are saying, from others that are on the oppressor side that are saying, I don't want my child to see themselves as an oppressor. I think this is the #1 issue that's facing American Jews today. Look under the hood, as Rob said, be sure that things that sound nice actually are nice and the only way to do that is look under the hood. Nobody's going to take care of this for us. It's not any one organization. It's not any specific legislation, and this will not go away. So it's up to every one of us to do something. I put in the chat the ACES toolkit that gives some things that you can do from small to big. If you'd like to hear more, reach out to us, and I will put our website and email as well, and we can give you more ideas, but there's a wide range there. There is a ton you can do, just do something.
Rob, what do you think people should be doing in order to mobilize now, educate themselves, and stop the bad form of ethnic studies from entering into their communities?
So I think that there's agreement on everybody who's been spoken tonight that we have a very significant problem on our hands, and it is not going away. I'm reminded of in the 90s, some of you remember there was a leader of the Christian Coalition, drawing a blank, Reverend Pat, well, whatever. And he wrote that if he can get 15% of any community to get behind him on an issue, he can win any election. And he proved to be an extraordinary organizer that generated huge power and influence politically across the nation. I think what we're witnessing here is a similar phenomenon. If you look what happened in California, there were a group of people who got themselves into a key place. They were able, by whatever political means, to become the drafters of the curriculum. And then they generated a curriculum that became the standard. Our observation is that it's likely that a similar effort was made here in Massachusetts, and we defeated it politically. What we have to understand is that we're talking to a lot of people right now about this ethnic studies issue. Most people that we talk to have never heard of it. They don't even recognize the programs that are happening in their backyard as ethnic studies or anything that should be concerning. What that means is we are involved in a political process. We shouldn't assume that everybody's against us. I think what the starting point is to assume most people don't know anything about it, but the people who are driving this are highly motivated. They have powerful support, particularly from national teachers unions. And they are extremely, extremely well organized. Both Lori and Elina referenced the Liberated Ethnic Studies Curriculum Coalition. They're now organizing support groups for when communities who are introducing critical ethnic studies get attacked, so that there will be SWAT teams that come from around the country to support them. This is a highly motivated group of people. They have significant backing in the university world, and they're going to push their wares. But what we also learned in Massachusetts was that when you engage people and you share information, it's possible to have some wins. Not a permanent win. This issue is not going away because the other side is highly, highly motivated and believes in what they're doing. What we need is a community of people that are going to do simple things. For example, meet with your legislature. If you haven't met your legislator, you need to go make an appointment and introduce yourself, your state rep, your state senator, and let them know that you've been hearing about these things and you're worried about it. That's simple. Pick up the phone, they will meet with you. We need a community that is mobilized, that is active. We also need a community that is selectively outraged. And by that, I mean, you don't get outraged at every dumb thing that somebody does. We need to be educators first and save our outrage when people really aren't listening. A lot of people, when you talk to them and they hear about it, they nod their head and they say, oh man, what do you do? I think we need to help. But the final thing I'll just offer is, there are alternatives. People want alternatives. And we are learning more and more about them. I think Elina has done some excellent work in this area. Others are doing some really good work in this area. We need to work together. There's a need to mobilize communities here. This is a fight. And it's a fight for the legitimacy of the Jewish community and Jewish interests. But it's not a fight against the whole world. It's not a fight against all our neighbors. It's a fight against a highly, highly motivated group of people who want to become much bigger than they are today.
I want Steve to answer this question as well. Thank you, Rob. But I realized from some of the questions that a little more background information is essential, and that is the way ethnic studies, at least in California, has been introduced is there's now will be, it's not in effect yet, but it will be in the next few years, and it has been already enacted in some communities, a graduation requirement that a student, in order to graduate, has taken at least one course in ethnic studies, just as you have to take, 3 of math and whatever the requirements are in your particular community. So it's not a replacement for other classes necessarily. It's just, it is a requirement. And so schools are frantically trying to figure out how to provide ethnic studies courses so that their seniors can graduate when this requirement becomes effective. I know Elina has discussed with me that lots of schools already have courses that cover what would need to be qualify as an ethnic studies course. So this peddling is happening by people pushing this particular version of ethnic studies. The schools are not aware. And Rob earlier talked about well-meaning but not knowledgeable legislators who thought, well, gee, that, it sounds like a good idea. Don't accept that. Do not accept that. these people need to do their due diligence. They need to know what's going on, and they're not going to unless you do exactly what Rob suggested, which is go and meet with your legislators and tell them that you are not going to accept, this is not acceptable course for your children. What is acceptable is positive learning about other communities, not negative harassment and demonizing of others. So Steve, I'm sorry to run over on this point, but I want to hear what you think people ought to do in order to prevent this bad form of ethnic studies from being introduced into their own communities.
Sure. Well, first, thank you. I first want to strongly agree with the comments that both Elena and Rob made, especially, you know, when Rob spoke about engaging in the political stratum, that they are the ones who are most responsive to the public and control the funding. So I just want to really reiterate what Rob said about that. Also, we need to we need to find good school board candidates and promote them and elect them. That's a very difficult thing to do, but we've seen it happen around the country. We've got to start doing that here in Massachusetts. School board members who really want a quality school curriculum. And we also have to demand evidence that there is a benefit to the ethnic studies curriculum. We should not simply accept the claims that are made. We want to see evidence. And we also want to talk about what is removed from the school curriculum in order to make room for like a mandatory ethnic studies course. What are they taking away from? We know that the ethnic studies courses are often being promoted in school systems that are already badly failing. And that's really troubling. I mean, the Boston school systems are in terrible condition. We should be promoting the best school curriculum possible. And I don't think what we see with ethnic studies really addresses that. That's a political agenda. So mainly for the people out in the audience, we need to make an effort to find out what is being taught in the schools. As Rob said, you don't have to have children in the schools. You can go to your town and ask to see what is being taught in the curriculum, and don't accept the claims that are made about existing curricula not being sufficient. Look at it and see. As I said, the Massachusetts curriculum framework was outstanding in 2003 and propelled Massachusetts students to the top of the nation in every subject tested at every grade level for 12 consecutive years. So don't accept the claims that the curricula is deficient. Investigate. And last of all, become involved in committees. I think you'd be amazed at how easy that can be, because I think a lot of what the other side gained advantage was they saw this opening and they just walked in the open door and took control, as Rob was talking about how they took control at the early stages of developing the curriculum in California. Why did that happen? So these are things that we need to get involved earlier, and we need to make our voices heard with the political stratum.
Yes, and I would add to that, speaking as a lawyer, it's not necessary to bring a lawsuit to wake some people up, the people who need to realize that others are watching. I have been able to, as others do, advise parents and teachers of their rights in situations when they're being gaslighted. Oh, we don't need to give you the reading list for your kindergarten child. Oh, it's covered by copyright, so we can't distribute it. You know, there are lots of easy questions. You don't need to have a lawsuit to get the answers. But sometimes you do need to have that kind of legal effort. What's even better is to have other parents join together, and Jewish groups, ally yourselves with other groups who are being marginalized through this version of ethnic studies or demonized, treated poorly. I mean, there are a lot of mistakes that are being made, clear mistakes in the educational material put out by these groups. And, you know, get teacher advisors to help you. join up with these groups that already exist, report to camera, tell AJC that you're concerned and ask what you can do. There is advice for people. I saw that one of the questions in the chat was whether or not this is an issue in Jewish schools. And I do know that although the liberated version of ethnic studies, that particular group is not being, no one's signing a contract with them in any Jewish group or schools that I know of. Other issues having to do with critical race theory is a problem in some Jewish schools. I've already had complaints from parents and have begun to work with some parents to try and address that issue. So the reason it's a real problem and one that's addressable in the public schools is because you have certain laws that allow parents to make demands or superintendents or supervisors or principals to set limits. For example, you may not know this, and I found it kind of shocking when I reminded myself, but teachers don't have a First Amendment right to express their opinions in public school classrooms. They check that at the door because they are acting as the government in that situation. So it's his opinion that this, my social studies teacher, it's his opinion that Israel is a fascist dictatorship. No, that's not acceptable. And by the way, Jews do have civil rights. So many Jews ignore that. They think civil rights are something for other minorities. That's not true. It's for all Americans, including Jews. And so you can demand that your own people, your children, yourself, are not criticized and demonized and discriminated against. You have rights, use them. Doesn't mean you have to hire a lawyer. Just open your mouth and share that point. It is a fact. So let's go to some other questions. I see that some people are concerned that with the different organizations that are not, Jewish organizations that aren't working on this issue. Well, you may be surprised to know that the American Jewish Committee, certainly in the Boston area, and perhaps Rob can tell us if elsewhere, is working on this issue. Camera is working on this issue. Elena's organization, the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, doesn't that sound like a wonderful alternative to liberated ethnic studies? They're working on this issue. And I'm missing some others. Elena, do you want to tell folks about some other groups perhaps that are working on this?
Sure. So AJC, as you mentioned, has done some great work, especially with Rob's leadership. There's also some work that's happening here in California under Rabbi Serena Eisenberg's leadership. Stand With Us has been involved in this space and has done some great work, including documenting specific, not only analyzing, but analyzing with appropriate messaging various issues that have come up and the documents that are coming out of Liberated. I think of some more, I'll put it in, but they're also, so Jewish and non-Jewish. So for example, a national group called Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, JILV, an organization that I'm actively involved with, is doing some great work in this space. They're a really strong partner. That's a national one. CFER, Californians for Equal Rights, that's an Asian group that is focused on California, but does some national work. I will think of others, I'm sure, and I apologize in advance for any that I didn't mention. Parents Defending Education, there's a whole slew of non-Jewish ones. So for those of you that are interested, please email me. I will put my email in the chat, and I will let you know which organizations are working in the space, because I will inevitably leave somebody out.
And I
I
guess.
would only add that
Okay, go ahead, Rob.
there's a huge amount of energy going into this issue, and as people understand it better, that is ramping up. I know that we're involved, as Lena said, in several cities where there are issues, and I think this issue has evolved. It started out surreptitiously. It was hard to know not only what it was, but how to understand it and who was behind it. To get to where the kind of presentations that you heard tonight has involved an extraordinary amount of energy, research, engagement, because the nature of the phenomenon has been working outside of the public view. I think what happened in California was functionally a wake-up call for a movement that has been evolving now for 50 years. And we have to understand that. You know, we do need to educate people. There's no question about this. And the other piece is people need to be mobilized. Organizations by themselves are only as good as the army that you have. If our Jewish community is outraged but not doing the work, it's not going to work. We can get in these fights. The Jewish community has done this before. This is not the first time we've seen the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. But it is, we've had these, this is a long-term fight, and we've got to mobilize and we've got to be smart. Outrage is easy. Tactic, strategy takes time, thought, and that's what we really need.
That's true for sure, Rob. Thank you for that. There are people who are asking about how they know whether liberated ethnic studies is being introduced into their state legislature. And so, Steve, why don't you take a shot at that? Help us understand how to be ready for that, how to know when it's coming. And
yeah, that's a good question. I would recommend, there's certainly a jargon that you see with the liberated ethnic studies, as we've all spoken about tonight. So I think that if people are looking into the school materials, please reach out to us, to any of us who know and can recognize the jargon that's used and can recognize that we're dealing with a political movement, political indoctrination, and not a real education curriculum. And so please reach out to us. That we can help people to understand and see. And look at our websites of all these different organizations that Elina has mentioned, and they'll point out that the jargon you should look for, the terms that they use, the slogans they use, and the goals that they set. If they're school curriculum, American school curriculum has not traditionally been about encouraging political activism among students. It's about educating students to become citizens, better citizens, capable of maintaining a democracy. It's not about getting students out, protesting and revolting. And so you have to look at these things, look at what the teacher is trying to do, and that's really a good indication as well.
Steve, would you post your email in the chat? People are asking for it when you're finished.
Sure.
That would be great. They want to get in touch with you, find out how to get in touch.
Yeah, I'll do that. The other thing too, I think it's important to understand is what makes this battle. Rob is absolutely right. This is a long-term battle. It's not going away. It's something we just have to. It's persistence is really the key to success here. There's not going to be one victory that's going to make it go away. It's just persistence, hitting at it wherever we can. And one thing to really understand is what we're going against is decades and decades of what teachers who come out of teaching colleges and graduate schools of education have been indoctrinated with. And so we also, at some level, we have to try to reach the teachers, to educate them better, to demand higher standards, licensure standards in states. There's a whole lot of different things that we can also talk about and recommend to our political echelon.
Okay, I see that there's a question about they're recognizing that there's domestic influence. Is there international influence in the promotion of this form of ethnic studies? And I can tell you from my experience in our lawsuit in California and Los Angeles that the teachpalestine.org, which provided the lesson plans for the Liberated Consortium, that material is from a website called teachpalestine.org, which is from the Middle East Children's Alliance. Get that, MECA, MECA, and they are aligned with and provide at least informational support and perhaps other support to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a recognized terrorist organization, both by the United States and Israel, but about 5 other countries, including, I think, England and Australia and others. And so, yes, there is some form of international support in terms of, how this material, this very specific material in particular about Israel is being provided. It's not coming right out of the traditional ethnic studies colleges. They are partnering. And the reason it's attractive is because they set up this comparison, this parallel between the so-called dispossessed Palestinians and the dispossessed Native Americans, and the whole brown bodies and black bodies. And by the way, all Israelis, according to the liberated curriculum, are white, even though we know more than 50% of Israelis are people from North Africa and the Middle East, and are Ethiopians, and are just as pigmented as the BIPOCs. So I think we're going to wrap up this portion of our seminar. I think this has really just been a very cursory introduction to a complicated long-term problem. I want to thank the panelists, Rob and Steve and Elina, and thank Temple Israel Natick, their Israel Action Committee, for hosting this event. And I'm going to turn the program over to Doobie Gordon, who is chair of the Israel Action Community at the Temple. Doobie?
Thank you very much, Laurie. And shalom, friends, and thank you for attending this critically important talk here this evening. Well over 300 people have attended tonight, and I'm sure many more on the recording. Again, I'm Doobie Gordon, chair of the Israel Action Committee of Temple Israel of Natick for the last 20 plus years, and our committee of well over 36 active members was the organizing committee. I want to thank personally and Ann Wayne, chair of the program, who imagined this event, and co-chair Cherry Bolliker, who brought it to fruition together. In addition, we want to thank Dan Green, who was responsible for the thought-provoking title, and Mike Richmond for his support and wise counsel. We'd like to thank Debbie Colton, the executive director, and Susan Feinstein, operations manager of the Lappin Foundation, for their generosity and kindness. The Lappin Foundation provided the Zoom platform for tonight and the design for the flyer. Also, thank you to Irv Kempner, CEO of the New England Friends of the March of Living, and Reverend Dr. Tricia Miller, President of Christians and Jews United for Israel, for their generous funding. and support of this program. We urge you to visit our sponsors and community partners' websites. These organizations are working diligently on our behalf. Thank you to our speakers, whose call to action and alerting us is as loud and clear as the blowing of the shofar in this month of Elul. And in alphabetical order, we want to thank Elena Kaplan, Rob Leikind, Laurie Lowenthal Marcus, and Stephen Stotsky. Extraordinary presentation. Thank you all. And to all who celebrate Shana Tova Umituka, thank you again. And a Laila Tov, good night.